Tonight, we're thrilled to have Jill Abramson here to celebrate the launch of her book, Merchants of Truth. We're very excited about that. We're also honored to have our partners in this event here with us tonight, the University of Washington Department of Communications and the Western Washington chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. Now, after the event, there will be a signing, and we will call row by row, so if you would like to get your book signed, just stay in your seats. But here to introduce tonight's guests is Sarah Toche, President of the Journalist Society.
Hello. Let's see if I can do this. Oh, awesome. Hi. Thank you all for being here tonight. You guys all know already what is about to happen, but a little rundown of the people you are going to be spending the next hour learning more about. Jill Abramson, senior reporter at Wall Street Journal from 1988 until 1997. She rose her way to the top, telling stories that many of us only ever dream about covering. She's encountered some issues along the way, which she'll talk about tonight, and have made her a stronger individual in the newsroom and outside of the newsroom. She has a new book out that highlights what goes on behind the scenes in the news, drawing from all of her experiences on the field and behind the scenes. With her is UW Professor in Communications and Washington State Professor of the Year from 2006, David Domke. Come on up, guys.
Well, good evening, everybody, and good evening, Jill Abramson. Welcome back to Seattle.
It is back to Seattle, but this is such a beautiful space. I've never been here.
This is a little bit nicer than most of the classrooms I teach in at the UW, right? Before we came out, I just asked Jill if she had some opening remarks to make, and so she's going to say a few things to start, and then I'm going to follow up with some questions. I have a few questions I prepared. A few we'll just kind of do back and forth follow-ups, and then I think at about 7:30 or so, we're going to see if there's questions that you all have. Okay? So please.
Yeah, please don't be shy. The question part from the audience is always my favorite. So I just wanted to make brief remarks to frame our discussion. I really think the topic of can this country sustain, a vigorous and healthy, high-quality press contingent is like so urgent and vital. And, we have a president who, has made the news media into like a foil, and he calls us all enemies of the people and fake news, and he targets in particular the failing New York Times, which is actually much healthier ever since he was elected. I think all of you have heard of the Trump bump. Well, that's brought about 2.5 million more digital subscribers to the New York Times since November of 2016. And as most of you know, in 2013, your own Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post and, supplied it, he called it the runway, supplied it with, replenished resources that brought it back very quickly to sort of the glory days of Ben Bradlee and Katharine Graham. And it's actually turning a profit. That too, is somewhat connected to the Trump bump. But, I think it's vital for all of us not to see what's happening as an issue of journalism, because the health of the news media in this country is a pivotal part of the health of our democracy. It's easy to forget, but the founders of this country were deathly afraid of over-centralized power and abuse of power by government officials or wealthy people. And, they decided to, protect a free press and enshrine that protection in the First Amendment, which is first for a reason. The founders envisioned that we, and many of you out there, would be watchdogs for the public, that we would bring them vital information that was key to decision-making in their lives, and would hold power accountable. And that has to remain vibrant and healthy in our country. And, that's why the subtitle of my book focuses on the business of news, because the business model is broken for so many local newspapers and others. And the fight for facts, we now live in such a polarized political environment that, people can't even agree on the same set of facts. So, I turned this into a narrative story, which was difficult, and I hope, that you'll read the book and both enjoy it and get something out of it.
Great. What I hope to do is ask kind of three chunks of questions. One is about the motivations behind the book and kind of the moments of clarity for yourself. Second is I want to ask you, as I've mentioned to you, some questions about the plagiarism claims. And then I want to ask you about kind of the future of journalism. So was there a moment at which the book just had to be written for yourself, where you're like, I just got to write this book? And is the book today the book you thought you were going to write?
Those are good questions. I knew I wanted to write this book right after I was fired as executive editor in May of 2014. After almost 3 years in the job, I was the first woman to hold that position, which is the most senior position in the newsroom. I'd been managing editor, the number 2 job, for 8 years, and Washington bureau chief before that, first female in all of those positions. But, I was summarily fired in 2014, almost at the same instant that something called the Times Innovation Report became public. And it was tough in its judgments that the Times had been too slow to adapt and transform itself in the digital world. That we weren't innovating on a fast enough timetable, and that there were all of these shiny new digital news organizations, Vice and BuzzFeed and Vox, and Mike was one of them at that point. But they were growing like Topsy and just full of ads. They were very good at getting ads, and print advertising was going this way. So, the Times was kind of envious of these digital upstarts. And so, the innovation report in some ways was critical of me because I'd been in these top jobs during the digital transition. And so the book, that I wanted to write was kind of my own innovation report. I wanted to go deep into, I decided, 4 news companies. They were BuzzFeed, Vice, both of which are, new and all digital. And then, what I consider to be, the 2 most important national general interest newspapers, the Times, where I had spent a large part of my career, and the Post. And I was kind of copying, I don't know if any of you remember a book by David Halberstam called The Powers That Be, which, is a kind of classic in the media genre. And he, too, told the stories of 4 companies. So that's when I knew I wanted to do this book, was the second I was gone from the Times. And I did the proposal very, very quickly. Was it the book that I is this book the book I expected to write? And it's not, because I always tell, reporters and my students who I try to teach reporting techniques to, that the most important thing when you're beginning to report a story is to be willing to be surprised, to not be so certain of how things are going to come out. So I was surprised. The story I thought I was writing was the rise of these, new all-digital news organizations, which didn't begin as news providers. And that was BuzzFeed and Vice, who were in their heyday when I began this project. And the Times and the Post were still struggling with some of the after effects of the 2008 financial crisis, the disappearance of print advertising, which was descending at an alarming rate, decreases in circulation. So I thought the legacy newspapers were looking insecure and envious of the new. But, I left the story, pretty much at the end of 2017. And by then, as I said in my opening remarks, the Times and the Post looked like they had both found a very sustainable business model and not just the deep pockets of a billionaire. And the new all-digital companies are being starved by Facebook and Google. All the advertising that flowed their way is now going to Facebook and Google, and they're scrambling to find new modes to support newsrooms, because one thing we both know is news gathering is very expensive.
So, did Donald Trump save the Times and the Post?
Well, he didn't save them, because neither of them were at near death's door in 2016. But he's been a boon to both of them for sure in many ways. Financially, because as I said, both the Post and the Times have many more subscribers now. People in general, and I'm sure it's true of all of you, suddenly got very serious after the election, and more serious about news and where they get news. And, while the president calls, the Post and the Times both fake news, I think a lot of people turned to them because they wanted to they didn't want to just get news anymore from their social media feeds. They were going back to trusted news organizations. And then, throughout his presidency so far, any story about Donald Trump gets a massive audience and tons of clicks. So he's been a boon in terms of reader interest, too. And the cable news shows that are on as we talk here have never had higher ratings. CNN is just swimming in money. So he's been good for business. He has.
If the New York Times called you, if the publisher of the Times called you tomorrow and said, we know we're making some mistakes, we need you back. We need you, we need your leadership back. What's your answer to that question?
My answer would be he doesn't need my leadership. It's good for any organization to have a turnover in leadership. And Dean Baquet, who is the executive editor now, is fabulous. He has a great news gut. He, knows how to calibrate the coverage, when to do, a big investigation like the masterful. It jumped into 4 full pages of the print paper, the examination of how the Trump family got so rich and avoided gift taxes. So, their leadership is perfectly fine.
So you
if the reverse,
you're not answering the question, though.
No, I'd say no.
You'd say no.
Yeah, I'd say no.
Okay. Okay. So I want to ask you. So you said
that doesn't mean I don't miss the newsroom.
Okay.
And when a big story hits, of course, I miss it all the more, and I start thinking like, how would I deploy the reporters and what backstories would I want to tell? But I'd still say no.
Sure. Like tonight when the Times broke the story that the president did in fact order his son-in-law to get security clearance. Like tonight, right? So you said you teach journalism students. I'm going to segue to the second phase of the questions now. You teach journalism students, and you've taken some significant criticism about the book, about sourcing, about material taken from other places, not adequately sourced. 2 questions. One is, if the student turned in this quality of work to you, what's your grade for them?
For the quality of this book, it would be an A.
An A.
I mean, it has some problems. I'd like to, in my words, say what they are.
Please do.
I neglected to carefully enough make sure that every footnote in this book, which is where people are credited and other people's articles and interviews are cited in 6 cases, and pretty much all of the criticism that's been heaped on me has come from Vice Media, which I guess didn't like its portrayal in the book. I thought their story is very interesting and pretty balanced, but in these 6 cases, the proper footnote and page were left out. But this was completely unintentional. And in the cases of 4 of them, they're credited, these very sources are credited in other footnotes. So why would I be crediting them throughout? This book has 70 pages of footnotes and 835 citations, credits. I'm very pained, and I've said how sorry I am that there's even 1 mistake or 6 that I missed. But it was inadvertent sloppiness, not the intention to steal anybody's work. And I've corrected all of this. Anything that's been, brought to me, I've corrected immediately for the next edition of the book and immediately in the ebook. And I've called some of the writers who, I didn't properly credit in those 6. And, I feel terrible about it. I take it very seriously.
Okay. Do you think that the criticism that at least Vice has leveled against you is a fair criticism or not?
Well, it's fair in that I neglected to properly credit places and authors 6 times out of 835. So yeah, it's fair. I want my work to be perfect and strive for that, and I fell short of that. So criticism is fair. I think, it has been eye-opening for me because the criticisms were leveled first on Twitter. I'd never been, at the center of a tweet storm before. And, it's a really destabilizing experience.
Yeah, can we talk about that for a second? Not in an evaluative.
We have to.
Yes. No, what that experience is like to be a public figure, as somebody whose motives I'm going to give you the total benefit of the doubt on this. Motives were good. You're trying to do really something good. And it's clear that when the book was published that the Vice folks were ready to go because the tweet storm, that is the most cited tweet storm, was ready to go, right? So what has that destabilizing, really interesting word you had? Can you just talk a little bit about that related to the democracy points that you made earlier of how this is destabilizing for our general pursuit of knowledge and truth?
Well, Twitter is I should start out by saying, it's great in many ways. And those of you out there who cover politics, for instance, I mean, it's become the ignition system.
It was great.
The ignition system for news. I mean, every reporter that I know puts a tweet out about their story before they've even written a story. And that's a reflection of both the fact that the audience wants to know news and what happened the instant it happens. And it reflects, the ever-increasing speed of the news cycle. It never stops. But, in terms of tweet storms, or what's also called tweet shaming, it quickly develops into an avalanche. And I was asked to respond to these 6 examples before I had even had a chance to read through them. I knew I had not plagiarized, so I was able to say that. But, then, as I sat calmly and went through it and tried to figure out what had happened, already, I probably had 30, media inquiries to do stories, all touched off by the tweet. Yeah. And, it was a lot to deal with. I'm not at all, I am a public figure. I'm really trying not to, portray myself as a victim. I'm not. But my children who, were looking at what was on Twitter, like on day one said, "Mommy, don't look at any of it." I said, well, what's really awful? I knew they said, it's about your looks, it's about your voice, it's even about your marriage to Daddy. Now, I've been with my husband since we're 20 years old. Like, what could that be? I don't know, but I don't want to know. It gets very personal and mean.
It certainly does, and it's an attempt, I believe, not just in your circumstance, but in all of these kind of moments to make it so painful for people that they don't come back, that they quit.
Yeah, I'm not a quitter.
Okay.
And I've answered questions about this in, every city I've gone to and at multiple venues in those cities. I'm not hiding. If I was inclined to hide, which I'm not, I would have canceled, the book tour,
Sure.
which I didn't want to do, and comfortable saying I was fired. I mean, not that many people are. So, I think I pride myself on just being pretty candid and a straight shooter.
I appreciate that very much. I want to segue into the last portion. If you have some questions, I think you have a chance to write them down, and then they're going to be brought up to me. I think that's the kind of methodology. I'm not positive. So you said you wouldn't go back to to lead the Times. But if you were a reporter starting out today, if you were one of your students coming out today, which of these 4 news organizations would you be most excited to get the job offer from?
I think BuzzFeed, because it's so different from the newsroom experiences I've had, which are mostly the Wall Street Journals, Washington Bureau, and the Times. And, BuzzFeed is a company that when I started reporting on it for the book, their biggest story was, what color is this dress? It was just a photo of a dress that the mother of the bride was going to wear to a wedding in Scotland. And she had someone take a picture of it. And some people saw it as blue and black stripes, and others were certain it was white and gold. And so BuzzFeed just posted the picture and the question, what color is this dress? And within days, 26 million people had clicked and registered their certainty about the color scheme. So, that was, and they still, have quite a bit of content, in the buzz part of BuzzFeed that is amusing, and, listicles and quizzes, at questions like, what Disney princess are you? But, during the course of my reporting, they developed a really terrific newsroom. They have an investigative group that has 20 journalists. I mean, that's sort of the size of what the Times' investigative unit was when I was there. And they were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize in International News last year for a big investigative piece they did about murders of Russian oligarchs in London that were Russian hit jobs, and it was incredible.
So what are the characteristics that would drive you?
Well, I would want to go there and do investigative reporting, which is my first love. And the second, after I was fired, besides, trying to conceptualize this book and get someone interested in publishing it, I went straight back to reporting. I never really completely stopped reporting while I was an editor. I had, some bylines in the Times, even as executive editor. I mean, I couldn't do, an investigative piece that I needed to report, for months on. But I did an investigative project right away about, the failure to even ticket drivers who kill pedestrians in New York City. And, worked on that kind of for the whole summer of 2014. And more recently, I went back during the Kavanaugh confirmation fight and looked back at all of the evidence of, sexual harassment against Clarence Thomas. Jane Mayer and I had co-authored the book Strange Justice about the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas confirmation battle. And, people, including me, I write a column for The Guardian, were drawing parallels between the Kavanaugh hearings and Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill. So I just wanted to take a fresh look at, what was known then, what's become known since then, since Jane and I wrote the book. And it was, quite a bit of interesting information. And I wrote that as a cover story in New York Magazine. So, I love reporting. I want to report to the end.
What would you say about ethics in journalism? Okay, in your span of your career, and then your deep dive here into Vice and BuzzFeed, but also just your general kind of knowledge about the news ecology, is there a different kind of ethics in journalism today that we need versus what it was 20, 30 years ago? Or is it the same thing and it's just different technologies?
I don't think it's just different technologies. And, I think that the best quality news providers still, are abiding by the best standards of journalism and ethics. The title of the book, Merchants of Truth, is because the business model for journalism became so challenged, and there still isn't one model that would sustain all of it.
Yeah.
And, in order to find new revenue streams, I think, all four of the companies that I write about in the book, not that they, are unethical, but that they, engage in, revenue producing products and activities like high dollar conferences that are sponsored by companies that they cover, that, at least during, my growing up in journalism years would never have been done. And the wall that existed between the business side and news sides of newspapers, and even, in the early days at BuzzFeed and Vice, there's a lot more blurring of those lines, which concerns me.
Would love to see what questions people have. So I don't, should I just take questions and then just repeat them? Okay, sure, go ahead. Yeah.
In the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos, the National Enquirer, is the Washington Post lucky because they have a very wealthy owner? So can he protect his editors and his writers? Do they feel like that he's got their back, and so they can dive deep, investigate, write a story, and Trump and various people, if they call them out if they make mistakes, it's one thing, but if they write a good story, and somebody shoots at him and Bezos has his back, do you think, is it an advantage for the Post to have a very wealthy owner? That's one. And two, what is your opinion about how Bezos shot back at the National Enquirer and the attorneys that were going to spread all these things?
Right, that we're basically blackmailing him
So
almost.
question one is, we'll just go one at a time here.
Okay.
Question, so everybody can know, question one was, is it a good thing that the Washington Post has the world's most wealthiest individual as its owner, or number one or number two? I can't keep these straight. But is that a good thing for the Post, for journalism?
I think he's been a good steward of the Post, and that he doesn't interfere with the news coverage in any way. I think where it becomes awkward, he bought the Washington Post as a personal acquisition, so it isn't part of Amazon. The New York Times did a big investigation of the workplace conditions at the big Amazon fulfillment warehouses, and that would be hard. I'm not saying the Washington Post wouldn't do that, but that's where it gets a little dicey. But he gives Marty Barron, who's a terrific editor of the Post, he keeps out of Marty's lane, and I really feel there's been kind of an old-fashioned newspaper war between the Post and the New York Times in covering the Trump administration. And, he's brought the Washington Post back. I mean, it had been cut and cut and cut, 5 series of buyouts and layoffs. And at the point the Grahams decided to look for a buyer and found Bezos, they were staring ahead at 7 years of more losses. So, it's been fortunate that at first, when he was called to see if he was interested, he said, why me? I don't know anything about the newspaper business. But then he started thinking about the importance of the Washington Post. He had watched the Watergate hearings on television, lying on the floor next to his grandfather. And, he felt like, can I help it? Can my talents help the Post? And he decided yes. And they did, yeah, they did. And, which is interesting, but they only did so after satisfying themselves that he would be a good hands-off steward. And, he's proven to be. And I thought that ad, in the fourth quarter of the Super Bowl, I don't know if you all saw it, but the Washington Post, I think, paid $5 million for an ad that is just a more compelling, ringing version of what my opening remarks were. It was about the importance of a free press and showing people, it was sad too. It showed some of the great journalists who have lost their lives trying to dig out the truth for all of us. So, and Bezos was all set and ready to do that. It's probably a toss-up between the Academy Awards and the Super Bowl where most people would see your ad and, without being direct or, clumsy, it was an obvious rejoinder to everything President Trump says about the free press.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to move past the second part of the question. Other questions? Yeah, I don't know who to pick, so back there. Yeah, go ahead. Yep, you.
Can you maybe stand up?
Do you favor the reinstatement of the fairness doctrine?
I don't have a strong opinion on that. I wonder whether if we still had the fairness doctrine, whether the news media, particularly on television, would be less polarized and less openly political as it is now. But, I really don't have a strong opinion on reinstating it. How about you?
I don't really see it as a sustainable mechanism in our media environment that we have today. It was written for a broadcast kind of space. Yeah, that's my take on it. Yep, right there. Go ahead.
Do you think the journalists or the media are really, really concerned about this attack? Or do they think this too will pass?
The question, I think, is...
Are they very concerned about the attacks?
The attacks of Trump?
Yeah.
No, the attacks on the First Amendment,
Uh-huh.
they're reporting the attacks on the free press.
Okay. Are journalists really concerned about that?
Is it germane to talk about the fact that the news media has very low trust numbers in the last decade? The trust numbers have been very low, and I think that is a big preoccupation of people leading our profession. And I worry that that the almighty Facebook algorithm basically separates all of us into ideological and partisan silos, because the way it works is it learns immediately what you like and what you share, and that's what keeps people on Facebook, and they want you to never leave. And so news on its news feed, which for 63% of adults in this country see most of their news on their Facebook feeds. So, you have, ideological camps getting news that reinforces mainly what they already think and believe. And that, also I think erodes trust, because what a lot of people have come to believe is that reporters are all partisans too. And, that is not true. But, I think from all of the studies I've looked at about why trust has eroded, the belief that the news media has become more openly partisan is like the top reason in many studies.
Yeah, there's some great Pew data, you're citing some of it now, but that separated what are the top trusted news sources, and then it breaks it across the ideological composition of the electorate. And on the left, from very liberal to like somewhat liberal to middle of the road, they trust the networks the most, CNN and the broadcast networks. And this New York Times and the NPR kind of falls off as you get closer to the middle. And then when you cross over to somewhat conservative, very conservative, none of those sources come over as the top trusted sources.
Except the Wall Street Journal, which is in the middle.
It's in the middle,
maybe
yeah.
Creeping,
But then,
right, is the most trusted.
But then Fox takes over, right?
Right, which is
not. Yes, back there, go ahead.
Good luck to the New York Times and the Washington Post, that's great, but there are other places where there are news deserts. And there are companies that buy newspapers and suck blood out and so forth. And you may have an answer to that if you haven't read this yet, but what happens besides the national press?
Yeah, what? What's the future as you see of local media and state and or regional media?
It's looking grim right now. I think something like 600 local and regional newspapers have shuttered or been sold in the past like 5 or 6 years. And when you say suck the blood, I mean literally the ones that are acquired are often acquired by vulture capital funds. And right now, one of those companies, Alden Capital, is mounting a hostile takeover bid for Gannett, which, owns at least some of the remaining, regional papers, especially in some local ones. But what these funds do is once they acquire a newspaper, they strip it down for parts. And, in the end of my book, I talk about the crisis of the local news desert. And again, it isn't a crisis for journalists. It's a crisis for democracy because, as you just said, it means that state legislatures, county councils, city councils, zoning boards, the most powerful local institutions are going uncovered. So the watchdog function that is why the First Amendment is first is lost, which is, a terrible thing. But, print advertising is disappearing everywhere. And, for local newspapers, classified ads were a big source of revenue. And in one fell swoop, Craigslist made that business go away. And, in many of the localities where these papers were once robust, all the local stores have shuttered, so there's no one to advertise. But that's the big crisis. And at the end of my book, I describe a demonstration that reporters and columnists from the Denver Post and the St. Paul Press Pioneer, both of which were acquired by Alden Capital and then cut to ribbons. The reporters demonstrated outside of the New York building where Alden is headquartered, and I interview a lot of them about what's happened to their papers. I wish more than anything that I had a solution. I'm on the board of ProPublica, which is an all-investigative news operation with, over 60 investigative journalists who try to do some projects with local newspapers. It's a great nonprofit, and there are some local versions of that. And they're great. There need to be more of them, but they don't fill the void. Do you have an answer?
Well, no, I don't, but I was going to point out that we have had for about 45 years here at the University of Washington a reporting program where our students during the legislature, which meets basically from January 1st to either spring or early summer, where our students move to Olympia and cover the legislature for news organizations in the area. And when that program started, and for many decades, they would go down there and be mentored by all these incredible journalists. And today, when our students arrive, and it's about 5 to 7 each year, they double the press corps in Olympia.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, they double it. We're going to do 2 more questions, okay? And then we're going to sell some books for Jill. So back there, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for being here tonight and sharing your thoughts. It's nice to have you here. My question is about, you've mentioned that during your career, you've been the first woman in a couple of your positions. And I imagine that that's been a lonely journey and a difficult one to be the first. It's hard to be a trailblazer. I'm wondering if you find that as you've progressed over time, we're still in an era where women are still the first at things. Is there more support by other women now than there was at the time when you were coming along and being the first, or is it what
I mean, unfortunately, right after I was fired, the Neiman Foundation did a survey of, women in the news business, and they found that, at the boss level, the, executive editor, managing editor level, the numbers had gone down, and it seemed a bitter irony to me that on the day that I was fired, the female editor of Le Monde was also fired over in France. But there are, fewer women in the most powerful leadership roles in journalism now. And, the numbers are worse for, for blacks and Hispanics, and that means that the people deciding, what's the most important stories for you to read are coming from a very sort of similar background and set of experiences. And, we're supposed to cover and reflect, the world that we write about and inform people about. And that lack of diversity is terrible. And when I was executive editor, I ordered up, a pay equity study to see if our newsroom, had a big gap. And, it did have one. And I also, in my first year as executive editor, made sure that the masthead, which is the names that get printed in the paper every day of the top editors, that became 50% women for the first time ever. I spent a lot of time mentoring, younger women editors and reporters. I championed, big series on, women in Afghanistan. I, turned Jodi Kantor onto a beat about gender, and after I was long gone, she's the reporter who broke the Harvey Weinstein story. So, that was crucially important to me, and I was very kind of bold and vocal about it. But, the industry as a whole looks very non-diverse still.
Yeah, the numbers from ASNE has been tracking women in newspapers and people of color in newspapers, and those numbers just don't budge. For years and years, I've been reporting those data in my classes, and every year it's just the numbers are not increasing. They're at a flat line. All right, one more.
Declining.
Or declining. Yes, they are. Yes, particularly. Let's see. I see everybody. I see lots of people. I see right over here.
I read your book about Clarence Thomas, and I was struck by the fact that nothing happened after the book came out. I wondered if you get distressed by the fact that facts come out, things seem to be true, there's nothing that goes against those facts, and yet nothing seems to happen. You talked about enjoying being a reporter. You report the truth and the facts, but then nothing happens, and it's distressing. I wondered how it is for you.
I feel over the arc of my career.
The question is about how does
sorry.
how does Jill feel about the fact that facts seem to come out, they seem to be damning facts, and lots of things don't change. That's what the question's about.
Yeah, and that sometimes it's after an event has already happened. A lot came out during the hearings for Clarence Thomas's confirmation, but the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, who was then Joe Biden, had made a decision to keep a lot of witnesses from testifying, and so not all the information was put before the public, and I do find that upsetting and a source of big concern. It's unsettling to me that there's a possibility that we have, 2 Supreme Court justices that may have perjured themselves during these hearings. And, that's a sobering thought. I wish, I have pieced together, and one of the courses I teach is a seminar called Journalism in the Age of Trump. And I've been trying in preparation for the classes to piece together what could have been known and made public about Russia's interference in the 2016 election and possible connections to the Trump campaign. And, there was, quite a bit of information that was known by editors and reporters. But, I think that decisions were being made under the assumption, which was the wrong assumption, that Donald Trump was not going to win. And so some of these matters, I think, some were investigated, but I think, some were not, to the point that, in the book I talk about Hillary Clinton, in October, knowing that there are supposedly, important Russia involving Trump stories coming out. But, in the case of one at the New York Times, she's waiting, and the headline was the opposite. It said, that the FBI had found no connections between Trump and Russian meddling. So, that's one, that I think, would have been much better for, more to be known before Election Day than here we are almost 3 full years later.
So I'm going to take a prerogative and ask one last question about journalism. And then I think we have make an announcement about book selling and signing. But if your answer to this question is yes, I'd like to know what evidence you have for it. Do you think that journalism makes a positive impact on society?
Absolutely.
What's your evidence?
My evidence is just, information is power. It
How?
really is.
We have a president, and all these things was said 6 weeks before the election. All these comments in the Hollywood Reporter come out, and all these things, and yet he wins the popular
but
vote.
before, President Trump, we had 8 years of President Obama, and everything goes in cycles, and throughout those cycles, yes, I do think journalism brings crucial information that does make change. Think back to Watergate. There were no campaign finance laws and no disclosure. What the coverage of the Watergate scandal brought down a president. The Pentagon Papers, which the Times published in June of 1971, opened, the public's eyes to the fact that, their president, President Johnson in that case, and the generals were lying about progress in the Vietnam War. And I think that and, Walter Cronkite's coverage of Vietnam, it's why public opinion turned against the war.
I totally agree with you, but that's 50 years ago. So what evidence do we have today that in this news environment that we live in, that any of this political coverage matters?
It does matter. We don't have Scott Pruitt around anymore. I'm not happy that, a lobbyist, Mr. Wheeler is the new head of the EPA, but the one Trump first put in the job was corrupt, and that was exposed by the news media. So I'm just not quite as pessimistic as you are.
Oh, no, I'm not pessimistic. I'm just asking you to kind of the evidence. I'm absolutely convinced that journalism makes a difference in non-political spaces around health questions, around education questions that do get discussed politically, but people can take action on in their daily lives. But in the spaces where we need political leadership to take action on things, I don't think our political leadership pays attention to the press in the same way political leadership used to pay attention to the press.
I think the person who pays the most attention to the press is Donald Trump, from everything I know. But did you want to hop in? We just have...
I just wanted to say that about over 150 journalists in Turkey are in jail.
Yeah, right.
Of course, there's power to journalism, and what we can do all around the world for that, that's another issue.
That's great. His point was that there's 150 journalists in jail in Turkey and in Venezuela and many places.
Jamal Khashoggi was killed in the Saudi embassy from the Washington Post. So, bringing the truth and the facts to the people is a high calling, and I can't think of a more important mission. And my book is dedicated to my friend Danny Pearl, who, lost his life right after 9/11 in Pakistan. He and I worked together at the Wall Street Journal. But, rather than, sort of ending on a down note, I'd just like to say, the reason I wrote this book and why I think it's so important is that, the way news is distributed, reported, and either made important or ignored is told as kind of a whale of a tale narrative. People have told me they missed their subway stop in New York because they were reading the books. So, we've been talking about these meta issues, which, are important to both of those and anyone in the profession. But this is a great story, I think. you will both enjoy reading it and learn a lot from it.
Thank you so much, Jill Abramson. Yeah.
Thanks for your great question.